Anyway, I am here to talk about wage and hour issues.
Should be good.
If I can figure out the clicker, we'll make this work.
There you go.
There we go. So we'll start with some state and local issues, and then we'll move on to some federal stuff after that. On the state side, a fairly quiet year. There are some important updates to go over. First and foremost, as you all know by now, the minimum wage here in Maine is now indexed to the Consumer Price Index. So it increases every year on January 1. For next year, that new number is going to be $12.75 an hour. So mark that down. And as you also know, exemption amount for salaried employees is related to the hourly wage as well. So that increases to $735 and change a week, which comes out to just a little over $38,000 a year annualized. So to the extent that you have exempt employees, you're going to want to take another look at that to make sure that they're still satisfying that threshold amount. But also importantly, remember, salary is just one factor for exemption. So, you know, that's something that we see more often than we would like, that people think you can just give somebody a salary and they're exempt from overtime. That's not the case. You have to meet some other factors as well. The tip credit, for those of you in the food service industry who use the tip credit, that's also tied to minimum wage. So that is now going to increase this year as well. That goes to $6.38. For anybody who has a location in Portland, I'm sure you're well aware by now that they have their own minimum wage requirements. That increases in January as well. That's going to go to $13, and that will make the tip credit down there in Portland $6.50. One other thing about Portland that I didn't put it on here is that the hazard pay provision of their ordinance that they passed a year or so ago is going to take effect in January of next year, which requires 1.5 times regular rate for workers who are working in a declared state of an emergency. But as of right now, we're not in a state of emergency as declared by the governor. But I'm just putting that out there as something that if one is declared, keep an eye on that if you have a location in Portland. A couple of statutes that were passed this year that relate to some extent to wage and hour issues. I'm not going to talk about these in detail because others will be getting into them later on, but one is an act to establish Juneteenth as a paid state holiday. That's June 19th of each year. So I put that out there for any government offices who might be joining us today. In case you follow the state holidays, just keep an eye on that. And then LD 1106, prohibiting employers from charging employees for direct deposits. I believe John's going to talk about that later. Just putting that up there to be mindful for wage and hour issues. Moving on to the federal side, there were some big changes to the tipped employee final rule. This is something that's been flip-flopping back and forth over the past couple of years. Those of you in the food service industry are probably aware of that. We had the 80-20 rule for a fair amount of time. And then in 2018, President Trump's administration basically rescinded the guidance on that. And in 2020, late last year, they actually introduced new rules to officially get rid of the 80-20 rule. Fast forward to 2021, President Biden's administration comes in and they withdrew what the Trump administration had submitted, and they proposed new rules to essentially reinstate the 80-20 rule. So what is the 80-20 rule? It's for employers who take tip credit, and it sets limits on how much time a tipped employee can spend on non-tipping activities. Essentially, what the new rule says is you can only take the credit when the employee is performing tip-producing work or work that directly supports tip-producing work. And they can't spend a, quote, substantial amount of time doing, that should say non-tip supporting work. There's a typo there, my mistake. What is substantial? More than 20% of the hours that they work in a work week, or more than 30 minutes consecutively in one block. So if you're spending that much time doing non-tip supporting work, you can't take the tip credit, and you have to pay minimum wage for time spent in excess of those thresholds. So that begs the question, what's tip producing work? Basically, it's all aspects of the service that you provide to customers for which you receive tips. That's the DOL definition, and that's about as helpful as nothing because it doesn't really tell you much. But the examples that they give do help to flesh that out a little bit. The examples they give are a bartender talking to a guest, making them feel comfortable, putting it on the TV show that they want to watch while they're sitting at the bar, wiping down their spills, all this that stuff that they're providing to the guests who will eventually hopefully tip them. Or a server getting a high chair for and a coloring book for guests who have a young child, things like that. That's all tip producing work. Tip supporting work is work set in preparation for tip producing work. Again, not the most helpful definition from the DOL, but here are some examples. Bartender getting a case of drinks from storage out back so that they can stock the bar, or cleaning the beverage station rather than a particular spill for one customer, or a server folding napkins or filling condiment containers, or busser setting tables, things like that. That's all tip supporting work. So you can take the 80-20 rule says you can take the tip credit if they're doing 80% of this stuff. That becomes effective the end of this year, December 28th. So the OSHA ETS, good gravy. If this isn't an example of what has been going on for the last 2 years, I don't know what is. We finally get the long-awaited ETS standards. Get ready to put it into a presentation to educate you all on it so that you can be ready when it goes into effect. And what do you know? It's been stayed. So they throw yet another wrench into all this. So as you probably all know by now, OSHA had just recently rolled out these emergency temporary standards for vaccine mandate for private employers with 100+ employees. They rolled them out a couple weeks ago. Just within the last week or so, there have been a number of federal lawsuits filed to challenge that, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is down in Louisiana, entered a stay, an injunction to prohibit enforcement of the ETS, arguably only within the Fifth Circuit. But in response to that, OSHA said that they weren't going to move forward with implementing this standard until they had further guidance from a court. And then since then, a number of other lawsuits were also filed, and they've been consolidated in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals on this issue. So as of right now, the brakes have been put on the ETS standards for 100+ employees. So that being the case, I'm going to kind of skip over this for the time being. I'll come back to it if we have time later, or if people want to have specific questions about it later on in one of our other sessions, we can address it. But I won't waste a lot of time on it, given its status right now. The U.S. Department of Labor, they issue opinion letters every year, which are helpful guidance for how to handle different wage and hour scenarios. A fairly quiet year at the federal DOL in terms of opinion letters this year. I want to say there were roughly 9 issued throughout the entire year. And they actually withdrew several of them, 3 or 4 maybe. In contrast to last year, there was 21, 22, something like that. So a fairly quiet year from the feds. Here are a few that I thought were interesting. One is opinion letter 2020-19, actually came out last year, but after our last meeting. It deals with the compensability of travel time for an employee who works remotely, but only for part of the day. And here's the hypothetical that they threw out. The employee normally works in an office from 8 to 4:30, and they have a 1-hour standard commute. In scenario 1, they say, assume that this person leaves work at 1 o'clock in the afternoon for a parent-teacher conference at their child's school. They drive 30 minutes from work to the school, have their meeting, and then they drive 30 minutes from the school back to their house. And then they work out the remainder of their workday at home remotely. And the question is the time that they spend driving from their office to the school compensable? And how about the school to the house? So that's fact pattern number 1. Number 2, I'm going to get to the answer later because it's the same for both questions. Hypothetical number 2, the employee starts working home early at 6 o'clock before their normal shift would start. And then they leave for a doctor's appointment at 8 o'clock. They drive 45 minutes to their doctor's office. They get there, they have their visit, and then they drive 15 minutes from the doctor's office to their work office. And they work out the remainder of their day at the office like they normally would. The question there is the time they spent driving from their house to the doctor's office compensable? And how about the doctor's office to their work? And how about their office to their home at the end of the day? The DOL said in each of these scenarios, the answer is no, none of this time is compensable. They said it is not worksite to worksite travel because none of this travel is related to the employee's work duties. It's personal travel for personal reasons. And it's not part of a continuous work day because during these times that the employee is driving, she is completely relieved from all work-related duties, and she's able to use that time for her own purposes for whatever she wants to do. So none of that time would be compensable in those scenarios. Opinion letter 2020-18 came out late last year as well. This addresses the question of what's agriculture for exemptions. This one I just picked because I thought it was a really interesting fact pattern, but it could potentially be relevant to some of the employers we have here in the state because we have lots of different types of agriculture. The farm at issue here is one that I'd never heard of before. It's an insect farm, and they make, quote, superworms, end quote, for animal feed. And they also raised crickets and some sort of roaches, I'm not even going to try that, for human consumption. And they had 3 different types of workers at this farm. They were all paid hourly. They had workers who fed, watered, harvested, cleaned, and breeds the insects. Not a job that I would want. The second category of workers are the managers who oversee everything. And then the third category is facility workers who do maintenance for where the animals are kept and so on and so forth. The question is, are any of these people employed in agriculture for purposes of fitting in under one of the exemptions for agriculture? The DOL said that agriculture includes traditional farming in all of its branches, which includes the raising of livestock, bees, fur-bearing animals, or poultry. This case actually ended up going to the Sixth Circuit, or a related case that was the impetus for this letter, excuse me. And the Sixth Circuit said that, yeah, that's all true about what they delineated for agriculture in the DOL regs, but Congress actually meant agriculture to be really, really broad. And they said, if you really think about it, there's not much to distinguish worm farm from traditional farms, other than the fact that it's a wacky thing that you don't see any day. And the meaning of farming isn't frozen in time. So I thought that was interesting because if you, we have companies around here that raise animals to be feed for other animals or raise animals for non-traditional purposes. If that's you and you haven't already looked at this, you might want to look at this to see if you could fall within agriculture for an exemption. Opinion letter 2020-1, this is the first one from this year. The question is, what falls within the scope of the administrative employee exemption? The facts were that the company is a life sciences products manufacturer, and the employees are account managers. They have at least a bachelor's degree, and they consult regularly with scientists who are their ultimate clientele. They learn about the client's needs. They research what sort of products their company has that might fit those needs, and they work with the client to develop individualized plans to figure out, hey, I think these products would work best for you, and here's how we can package them. They're paid a base salary above the minimum threshold, and they also get commissions. The question is, do these people qualify as exempt under the administrative exemption? The DOL said yes. As just a refresher, they said that the administrative exemption applies when you're paid, number 1, on a salary or fee basis. Number 2, your primary duty is office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of your company or your customer's company. And your primary duties also include the exercise of discretion and judgment with respect to matters of significance. And so the DOL looked at all this and they said that the account managers here, their non-manual work and it's directly related to the management and operations of their clientele. And they're engaging in significant work that's not just merely closing sales. It's not like somebody comes to them with a pre-filled out sales order that they just sign off on. But instead, what they're doing is they're working very closely to tailor-make something for this particular customer's needs. And then, if I can get the next slide to come up. All right, so that's why that was the most particular or the most significant fact that the DOL ruled on for the administrative exemption, was the fact that this was a custom-made plan for the customer. Letter 2021-6 is a staffing firm, a retail or service establishment. Again, this comes for potential exemption issues. It's a staffing firm that places workers in temp to hire positions. They sign a worker to work with a client, and they employ that worker for a period of time, and they're the one who pays their wages and benefits and insurance. And then if after a period of time the client and the worker agree to enter into a permanent working relationship, the staffing firm and the temp worker part ways at that point in time. The question in that one is, are the employees of the staffing firm who are engaged in operating the business, so the people who are actually sending the clients or the workers out to different clients, are they eligible for the retail or service exemption? So not the temp workers themselves, but the other people. The DOL said maybe they are. They said there's an exemption for employees who work at a retail or service establishment whose regular rate of pay exceeds 1.5 times the minimum wage, and whose earnings in a representative period are more than 50% commissions. And so they define, what's interesting about this one is they define what's a retail or service establishment. And it's a business that's engaged in making the sale of goods or services, and 75% of those have to be to retail, and the flip is that is not more than 25% for resale. The DOL said that the sale of staffing is a sale of goods or services. And for the retail prong, they said what you look to is, are you making this available to the general public? So, general employers. Is it something that serves the everyday needs of the community? Is it the end of the stream of distribution, meaning you're not loaning out workers to another temp agency, but you're right to the end client who's going to need their labor? They say if you tick all those boxes, then that can be sale of goods or services in retail, and therefore your employees might be able to meet this exemption. So if you're a staff agency and you haven't looked at this one, you might want to take a peek at it. And then just to quickly wrap up, you all might have heard of the PAID program, which was something that was implemented by the Biden administration. It's the Payroll Audit Independent Determination Program, which was a federal program that allowed employers to self-report essentially minimum wage and overtime violations to the federal government. And the way that it worked is if you had violated the laws, you would pay the wages that were owed, but you could avoid penalties and liquidated damages. That program has been terminated by the Biden administration, ended January of this year. It's probably signaling that the Biden administration is going to take more of an emphasis on DOL-initiated audits, presumably with a bigger focus on liquidated damages and penalties for violations. So the program is done. Don't go self-report anymore if you have any wage and hour violations. It's not going to work out well for you. And just keep this one on your radar.